For centuries, the idea circulated that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed all at once. Some say it was Julius Caesar's fault. Others blame the Christians. Some mention Caliph Omar. The truth is, all of these accounts gain traction, but they hide one essential detail. In this video, you're going to learn what really happened to the Library of Alexandria. Behind the burning of Alexandria, ancient Egypt, and the wars involving ancient Rome, there's a much longer, more complex and silent story. And now, for the first time, you'll discover the true end of the most famous library in ancient history.
In the heart of the ancient city of Alexandria, on the shores of the Mediterranean, stood one of the greatest centers of knowledge in human history, the Library of Alexandria. Founded around the 3rd century BCE, during a time of cultural flourishing under the Ptolemaic Empire, it housed thousands of scrolls from every corner of the known world. It was more than a building. It represented an entire civilization's effort to understand the universe. But what really happened to this symbol of knowledge? What was truly lost, and what is just myth? If you want more videos that dive deep into stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. At the end of the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great was crossing Egypt during his campaign to conquer the Persian Empire. In 321 BCE, he chose a strategic location near the Mediterranean Sea to found a new city that would bear his name, Alexandria. The site was privileged, between the sea and the Nile Delta, allowing easy access to maritime trade in the African interior. The goal was to create an urban center that merged Greek ideals with the potential of ancient Egypt. With that, one of the most important cities in ancient history was born. Although Alexander never saw its completion, the project was set in motion. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals divided the conquered empire. Egypt came under the control of Ptolemy I Soter, who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. Upon taking the Egyptian throne, Ptolemy made Alexandria the capital of the kingdom. His goal was clear: to consolidate political power while building a center of Hellenistic culture that would serve as an intellectual reference of the ancient world. Alexandria was envisioned not only as an administrative capital, but also as a nucleus of ancient knowledge. Greek culture formed the foundation, but the project also aimed to integrate Egyptian and Eastern traditions. Ptolemy I initiated a project that his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus would expand with even greater intensity, the Museum of Alexandria. Inspired by the Greek word musen, meaning Temple of the Muses, the complex was an institution dedicated to research, teaching, and the preservation of knowledge. Within this space, the Library of Alexandria began to take form. It was not just an annex, it was a fundamental part of the museum's vision as a complete scientific center. There, the knowledge of antiquity would be studied, preserved, and expanded. The goal was to gather all ancient manuscripts and papyri from the known world. The founding of the Library of Alexandria was deeply tied to prestige politics and the Ptolemies' quest for legitimacy. By investing in ancient science, Hellenistic culture, and historical libraries, the rulers of Hellenistic Egypt sought to project Alexandria as the rightful heir to Athens. The city became the new beacon of knowledge, contrasting with the past glory of mainland Greece. This ambition helped attract ancient philosophers, translators, mathematicians, and scholars from various parts of the world. Alexandria began offering unique conditions for research and intellectual debate within the context of ancient history. Alongside the intellectual elite, the city also grew as an economic and urban center. Hellenistic culture spread throughout its streets, markets, and temples. Ancient Egypt entered a new phase of cultural fusion, where millennia-old knowledge intersected with Greek methods and ideas. It was in this environment that the museum and library thrived. The government financed not only the construction of the buildings, but also the sustenance of the resident scholars. This created a structure unheard of at the time, a permanent academic community exclusively dedicated to producing and preserving knowledge. The Ptolemaic effort transformed Alexandria into a reference. Ships docking at the port were required to hand over any books they carried so they could be copied and added to the collection. This aggressive acquisition policy rapidly expanded the volume of works. The papyri obtained became part of what would be considered one of the greatest repositories of knowledge in antiquity. Although still in its early stages at this point, the project already showed its potential. It was the beginning of the formation of an unprecedented center where science, philosophy, and literature converged under one roof. The city's foundation and the early steps of the museum and library were not merely architectural or administrative events. They were strategic decisions that shaped the course of preserved and lost knowledge throughout history. Alexandria emerged as the new capital of wisdom in the Mediterranean, reflecting both the legacy of Alexander the Great and the political astuteness of the first Ptolemies. But this was only the beginning. The true impact of the Library of Alexandria on the ancient world and its fate at the hands of future empires was still to come.
Within the complex of the Museum of Alexandria, the library began to take shape as an ambitious project to gather, preserve, and organize all the knowledge of antiquity. The initiative was part of a state policy adopted by the first Ptolemaic kings, especially Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II. The library was seen as a natural extension of the museum, functioning not only as a repository, but also as an active center for knowledge production. Its goal wasn't just to store papyri, but to classify them, translate them, and use them as a foundation for new discoveries. It marked the birth of one of the most influential historical libraries of all time. The structure of the Library of Alexandria followed unprecedented standards for its time. The papyrus scrolls were arranged in vertical shelves called armaria, sorted by themes, authors, or regions. The catalog was maintained by scholars known as royal librarians, the most famous being the poet Callimachus, who is credited with creating the world's first cataloging system. His work resulted in the Pinax, a set of volumes organizing authors alphabetically by literary genre and including additional commentary. This demonstrated a level of systematization never before seen among ancient libraries, setting a model for future institutions. To build the collection, the Ptolemies adopted an aggressive manuscript acquisition policy. All ships docking at the port of Alexandria were inspected, and any scrolls or text found was seized for copying. The originals were often kept in the collection, while copies were returned to the owners. Additionally, ambassadors were sent to other regions to purchase or copy manuscripts in foreign languages such as Hebrew, Persian, Indian, and Egyptian. In this way, the library accumulated works far beyond the Greek world, becoming a true mirror of ancient knowledge. One of the most well-known projects at this period was the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, known as the Septuagint. It is believed that around 70 Jewish scholars were invited to work on the translation of the sacred texts. This initiative shows how the Library of Alexandria not only gathered ancient documents, but also promoted their linguistic and cultural adaptation to make them accessible to new audiences. The library was, therefore, a bridge between civilizations, connecting different knowledge traditions through translation, study, and preservation. Among the many scholars who worked in the library were figures such as Euclid, considered the father of geometry, Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed the heliocentric theory centuries before Copernicus, and Archimedes, one of the greatest inventors and mathematicians of ancient history.
These thinkers not only consulted ancient manuscripts, but also produced new knowledge that was recorded and stored in the library itself. This made the space an active hub of ancient science, with direct impact on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Although estimates vary widely, it is believed that the Library of Alexandria housed between 40,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls at its peak. The exact number remains uncertain, but the scale of the collection is supported by various authors from the time and later periods. What is certain is that no other library in ancient history matched its ambition in scope, diversity, and organization. The project reflected the Ptolemies' desire to put Alexandria at the center of global intellectual production. The library became a symbol of the power of Hellenistic Egypt, reinforcing the city as the heart of knowledge in the Mediterranean. This extraordinary growth, however, came with logistical and political challenges. Maintaining the collection required continuous investment, regular copying, and protection from deterioration. Additionally, over the decades, internal and external changes to the empire would begin to affect the stability of this monumental project. Even so, in this initial moment, the Library of Alexandria represented the height of human knowledge organization and preservation. But the events that would unfold in the following decades would put this legacy at risk and would begin to cast the first shadows over the fate of the greatest library in ancient history.
During the reigns of Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III, the Library of Alexandria reached its greatest period of expansion. With full support from the royal court, investments in acquiring, copying, translating, and preserving texts intensified. Ptolemy II maintained a staff of resident scholars who received housing, food, and salaries to devote themselves entirely to research. It was an environment where the knowledge of antiquity was valued as a source of power and prestige. The library became more than just an intellectual symbol. It was also a political tool that reinforced Alexandria's prominence in the Hellenistic world. The growth of the collection resulted from systematic and pragmatic policies. Every ship that docked at the port was inspected. If manuscripts were found, the texts were immediately taken to be copied by the library's scribes. In many cases, the originals were kept in Alexandria, while only the copies were returned to the owner. This process allowed the library to accumulate unique versions of rare documents that existed nowhere else. It was an aggressive yet effective strategy for building the largest collection of ancient manuscripts ever assembled in a single institution. Another method adopted was sending emissaries to foreign cities with the mission of acquiring books. Ptolemy III himself wrote to the rulers of Athens, requesting the loan of the tragic works of Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus. The copies were made, but the originals were retained. Meanwhile, scholars were called upon to translate works from Eastern cultures. As a result, texts from Mesopotamia, Persia, India, and ancient Egypt became part of the collection, translated into accessible Greek versions. This diversity further strengthened the Library of Alexandria's status as a universal repository of ancient knowledge. The presence of these texts allowed resident scholars to compare philosophical doctrines, mathematical methods, medical treatises, and astronomical theories from different traditions. This convergence of cultures created a unique research environment where knowledge was not just stored, but constantly reimagined. Alexandria became a place where ideas from Greece, Babylon, Egypt, and the Persian world interacted. This confluence contributed to the advancement of ancient science and expanded the library's role as a hub of intellectual innovation. Among the names associated with the library during this period are the aforementioned Callimachus, author of the Pinaques, Aristarchus, who proposed the heliocentric model of the solar system, Hipparchus, who developed methods for measuring celestial distances, and Herophilus, a physician who performed human dissections to study the nervous system. Many of these researchers produced treatises that became part of the collection itself, feeding the cycle of production and preservation. The Library of Alexandria was not merely a collection of ancient manuscripts, it was also an active center for creating new knowledge. Accounts from the time suggest that the number of papyrus scrolls exceeded tens or even hundreds of thousands, while estimates vary between 40,000 and 700,000 volumes. What matters is that the collection covered virtually all areas of available knowledge: philosophy, mathematics, medicine, botany, astronomy, poetry, law, and history. It was all there. The library structure was designed to receive, organize, and protect this vast material. Even without modern technology, the staff used classification and preservation techniques that allowed them to handle large volumes of documents. This peak transformed the Library of Alexandria into a reference point for all historical libraries that followed. It was considered the center of ancient knowledge, a meeting point for ancient philosophers, and a place of debate among different cultures. But while its intellectual prestige grew, the political and social factors of the Hellenistic world began to shift. Internal disputes and external threats would soon affect the stability of the Ptolemaic Empire. What had been built over decades was about to face pressures that would put the survival of this legacy to the test, and the fate of the library would begin, little by little, to change.
During the height of the Library of Alexandria, the need arose to expand its storage and organizational capacity. With the enormous quantity of papyri and ancient manuscripts accumulated over the years, the original facilities within the museum became insufficient. In this context, the Ptolemies decided to use the Serapeum, a large temple dedicated to the god Serapis, as the site of a second library. Located on a hill in the southwestern part of the city, the Serapeum was adapted to also serve as a center for preserving the knowledge of antiquity. Thus, the Second Library of Alexandria was born. The Serapeum was already an important temple in the religious life of Alexandria. Created as a symbol of the fusion between Greek and Egyptian beliefs, the cult of Serapis represented the cultural union promoted by the Ptolemies. Integrating the space into the library system was not only a practical move, but also a strategic one. The temple had a solid structure, spacious halls, and a secure location, all of which favored the storage of ancient manuscripts. As such, the new library functioned as a physical and symbolic extension of the original, reinforcing Alexandria's central role in the world of historical libraries. Although there's no precise data on the number of works stored in the Serapeum, ancient sources suggest that a significant portion of the main library's collection was duplicated and sent there. This did not mean a permanent separation between the two units, but rather a functional division. While the museum housed scholars and served as an active research center, the Serapeum focused more on the conservation and protection of texts. This two-pillar structure reflected a growing concern with preservation, given the risk of papyri deterioration and the natural wear caused by time. Some accounts indicate that the Serapeum's library was also accessible to the public, unlike the museums, which had more restricted access for invited scholars. This openness expanded the social role of knowledge in Alexandria and strengthened its image as a city dedicated to the dissemination of learning. The presence of two interconnected libraries allowed not only greater security, but also broader circulation and consultation of manuscripts. The duplication of works and decentralization of the collection were measures that showed how complex and advanced Alexandria's library system was for its time. The Serapeum, in addition to being a temple and library, had reading rooms, areas for copying texts, and possibly sections dedicated to translations. The integration of religious and intellectual functions was common in antiquity, and in Alexandria it reached a sophisticated level. The Temple of Serapis became a space where spirituality and ancient science coexisted.
This aligned with the Ptolemy's cultural project, which aimed to unite Egyptian tradition, Greek thought, and Eastern knowledge within a single institutional framework. In this context, the Serapeum reinforced the idea of Alexandria as the capital of Hellenistic culture. The creation of this second library can also be seen as a preventive measure. Aware of the fragility of the materials, the library's administrators knew that any damage could result in irreparable loss. The Serapeum thus provided an additional space to store duplicates and divide risks. If a disaster were to occur in one location, part of the knowledge would be preserved in the other. This concern for the collection's safety shows the degree of importance the Ptolemies placed on preserving accumulated knowledge. It was a system designed to withstand time and the uncertainties of the ancient world. With the Serapeum in operation, Alexandria solidified its position as the city with the largest library complex in the ancient world. The union between the museum and the temple enabled more efficient management of the collection and created a physical network of knowledge. But this same temple, which for decades stood as a bastion of Hellenistic culture and learning, would also, centuries later, become a stage for religious tensions and political conflicts. And when the structures of the city began to crumble, the fate of the Serapeum and its library would take on new meaning in the story of lost knowledge.
In 48 BCE, Alexandria became the stage for one of the most decisive battles in Roman history. Julius Caesar had arrived in Egypt while pursuing Pompey during the civil war that divided Rome. Upon reaching the city, Caesar became directly involved in the power struggle between the siblings Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII for the Egyptian throne. Caesar's open support for Queen Cleopatra triggered violent conflict with Ptolemy's forces. Egypt, already politically unstable, became a new front in the fight for control of the empire. And it was in this context that the most cited episode regarding the destruction of the Library of Alexandria took place. During the battles in Alexandria, Caesar ordered part of the Egyptian fleet to be set on fire in the city's port, aiming to prevent the enemy's advance. The flames spread quickly, reaching warehouses, nearby structures, and part of the urban center. Later accounts, such as Plutarch's, claimed that the fire reached buildings containing books and papyri, fueling the idea that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed at that moment. This version became one of the most repeated throughout history, although there are weak points in its documentary support. Contemporary authors of Caesar, such as Cassius Dio and Suetonius, do not directly mention the library's destruction during the conflict. Caesar himself, in his writings about the Egyptian campaign, makes no reference to any loss of the collection. Plutarch, writing more than a century after the events, is the earliest source to suggest a connection between the port fire and the loss of ancient manuscripts. However, he does not describe the destruction of the library as a confirmed fact, but rather as a possibility. This raises questions about the true extent of the damage caused during that episode. Furthermore, the geographer Strabo, who visited Alexandria decades later, described the museum and its library as still existing and functioning. This information suggests that if there was any loss of works, it was not total and did not interrupt the institution's operations. This continuity weakens the idea of complete destruction caused by Caesar. It is possible that nearby storage areas were affected and that part of the collection was damaged, but there's no evidence that the main library, located inside the museum, was consumed by the flames. Another hypothesis considered by scholars is that the fire reached secondary storage areas, such as annexed warehouses or locations used for temporarily holding newly copied texts. In this scenario, the number of manuscripts lost would have been significant, but not catastrophic. The main library, safeguarded within the museum complex, had a robust structure and reinforced security. This may have prevented the fire from spreading to its main halls. In any case, available sources do not allow certainty about the real scale of the losses. What is known is that despite the fire, Rome's presence in Alexandria was consolidated in the following years. After Caesar's victory and Cleopatra's definitive rise to the throne, Egypt established stronger ties with Rome, directly affecting the city's political and cultural autonomy. Roman control did not immediately lead to the library's decline, but altered the government's interests and priorities. The alliance between Cleopatra and Caesar, and later with Mark Antony, created a new power dynamic, and with it, the direction of knowledge preservation also began to shift. Even if the Library of Alexandria survived Caesar's fire, the episode marked the beginning of a new era. The city ceased to be the center of an independent empire and became a territory under Roman influence. This new context would gradually impact the library's funding, maintenance, and purpose. Political and strategic priorities began to override scientific ones, and over time, subtle neglect would start to threaten what the fire had failed to destroy. The blaze that ignited in the port may have been, perhaps, the first signal at the end that was drawing near.
Even after the fire in the port of Alexandria during Julius Caesar's campaign, several pieces of evidence suggest that the Library of Alexandria continued to function, at least in part. The main indication comes from the writings of Strabo, a geographer and historian who lived between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. He visited Alexandria a few decades after Caesar's involvement and described the museum in detail. In his notes, there were clear references to the museum complex still being active, with spaces dedicated to study, research, and manuscript cataloging. This indicates that the library was not completely destroyed. Other authors from the same period reinforce the idea of continuity. Galen, a Greek physician from the 2nd century CE, mentions in his works access to several manuscripts that was said to come from the library. His accounts suggested part of the collection still existed and was being used in medical and philosophical studies. This not only contradicts the idea of total and immediate destruction, but also shows that even under Roman control, Alexandria maintained some intellectual activity linked to the former library project. The lost knowledge, therefore, was not yet a full reality at that time. Additionally, there are administrative records indicating that the Roman government approved expenses related to the museum's maintenance. This institutional structure included a body of scholars, staff, and scribes, funded with public resources. The continuation of this activity after the military events of 48 BCE reinforces the thesis that the fire affected only peripheral areas or secondary storage sites. The main library halls located within the museum may have escaped the flames. The absence of sources reporting a total shutdown at a library during this period further supports this interpretation. Another important clue lies in how later sources treated the episode. Even authors like Plutarch and Lucan, who wrote about Caesar's fire, do not mention the end of the library as a confirmed event. Instead, the incident is cited as a possible partial loss, an indirect consequence of the fighting. This vagueness shows that even among intellectuals of antiquity, total destruction was not a consensus. The narrative that the library was burned down all at once gained more strength only centuries later, likely as a more dramatic symbol of cultural loss. The continued operation of the Serapeum, which served as the city's second library, reinforces the idea of survival. There is evidence that part of the texts originally stored in the museum was transferred to the temple, either as a precautionary or organizational measure. This allowed the collection to keep being preserved and accessed, even under a new structure. This adaptation to the political and urban context shows that the management of the library was not abruptly halted, but rather adjusted to the new realities imposed by Roman presence and changes in the city. Although the impact of the 48 BCE fire was significant, the available sources do not support the conclusion that it marked the definitive end of the Library of Alexandria. The lack of direct reports of irreversible destruction, along with later testimonies about the ongoing use of ancient manuscripts, points to a more complex reality. The decline at a library, it seems, was a gradual process, not the result of a single act of devastation. The image of a sudden collapse appears to be more of a myth constructed later than a proven historical fact. This overlap of documentary silence, fragmented accounts, and historical gaps leaves room for multiple interpretations. However, what records from the time suggest is that Alexandria still held on to part of its intellectual legacy even after Caesar's arrival. The library remained alive, even if wounded, and its end, if it was near, had not yet arrived. What came next would be a sequence of political, social, and religious transformations that would slowly place the project on unstable ground, and that new chapter was beginning to form on the horizon of the Roman Empire.
With the consolidation of Roman rule in Egypt, the Library of Alexandria began to face a new kind of threat: silent abandonment. Unlike fires or invasions, this process did not involve overt violence, but rather a slow shift in political and administrative priorities. Rome saw Alexandria as a strategic and commercial center, but not necessarily as an intellectual hub to be preserved with the same resources and dedication as in the Ptolemaic era. The funding at a museum and the library, once a state priority, came to depend on the will of local administrators and the imperial policies of Rome. Over time, the number of resident scholars began to decline. Official sponsorship for the intellectuals working at the museum was cut or redirected to other areas deemed more urgent. The library, which once housed dozens of full-time researchers, saw its activity gradually diminish. Without constant maintenance, the collection was no longer updated, and many papyri began showing signs of deterioration. Egypt was becoming just another province within the Roman Empire, and Alexandria was losing its status as the cultural capital of the Mediterranean. The political centralization in Rome and later in Constantinople weakened Alexandria's role as a center for intellectual decision-making. Local institutions were absorbed into broader administrative systems, and investments shifted to other regions. Meanwhile, the library faced technical challenges. Papyri required very specific conservation conditions, such as low humidity and constant pest control. Without the human and financial resources to ensure these measures, the risk of natural deterioration grew with each passing decade. The museum itself, once the heart of the cultural complex, began to operate in a limited capacity. Some departments were deactivated, and there are reports that parts of the facility were repurposed for other uses. The library, though still in existence, was no longer a priority. Its symbolic presence remained, but its effective functioning weakened. This phase marks the beginning of what historians call institutional hollowing, when a structure continues to exist physically but no longer fulfills the purpose for which it was created. The Library of Alexandria entered this stage quietly, without any visible breaking point. Meanwhile, other cities of the ancient world began to take on intellectual prominence. Rome, Ephesus, Pergamon, and later Constantinople started to attract scholars, works, and investments. The decentralization of knowledge further reduced Alexandria's cultural prestige. What was once an exclusive hub of knowledge now competed with other centers offering better academic support. This weakening of Alexandria's position in the cultural landscape of antiquity was reinforced by the loss of political support, regional instability, and the rise of other governmental priorities. During this period, there are no reports of fires of violent destruction. The loss was of another kind: the absence of copying, the failure to replace damaged manuscripts, and the gradual disappearance of documents due to everyday neglect. This kind of destruction, slow, silent, and invisible, is often more devastating than singular events. The Library of Alexandria, once a model of organization and innovation, became an example of how lack of interest can erode even the grandest of projects. The knowledge lost there was not due to external enemies, but to internal erosion of priorities. This gradual process intensified throughout the 2nd century CE and gained momentum in the 3rd century, marked by crises within the Roman Empire, political instability, and internal disputes. Alexandria was no longer a center for strategic or intellectual decisions. The city retained some commercial relevance, but its cultural role diminished amid constant neglect. The library, in this context, became only a shadow of what it had once been. And while the world changed around it, the papyri on its shelves quietly decayed. The fire threatening its existence no longer came from outside, it came from oblivion.
Starting in the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire underwent a profound transformation in its religious structure. With the rise of Christianity and its later establishment as the official state religion, old practices and temples considered pagan began to be rejected and gradually shut down. Emperor Constantine took the first steps in this process by legally favoring Christianity, but it was under the reign of Theodosius I, at the end of the century, that measures became more direct and widespread. In this context, various temples of the ancient world were targeted for closure, destruction, or religious conversion. In 391 CE, Emperor Theodosius issued decrees officially banning the worship of pagan gods throughout the empire. Based on these orders, the Bishop of Alexandria, Theophilus, received authorization to close or demolish still active temples in the city. Among them was the Serapeum, the great temple dedicated to the god Serapis, which had also served as Alexandria's 2nd library for centuries. The site, a symbol of the fusion between Egyptian tradition and Greek thought, was now seen as an obstacle to the consolidation of Christian faith. For that reason, it became a direct target of actions commanded by imperial authority. Historical sources like Socrates Scholasticus and Rufinus of Aquileia report that the Serapeum was attacked by groups of Christians led by Theophilus with support from local troops. During the attack, statues were smashed, altars destroyed, and worshippers dispersed. The temple, which had already lost much of its religious function, was looted and its structures damaged. The destruction of the Serapeum marked not only the end of a spiritual center, but also the physical collapse of one of the structures that housed part of the city's bibliographic collection. And although there's no consensus on how many manuscripts were still stored there, the event is considered a turning point. One particularly relevant account comes from the Christian historian Paulus Erosus, who visited Alexandria about 2 decades later. According to him, the boxes of books once kept in the Serapeum were found empty, suggesting that the texts had been destroyed, dispersed, or relocated. This mention is one of the few direct textual evidences pointing to the possible loss of manuscripts during that episode. Still, it cannot be stated with precision whether the contents were burned, reused, sold, or transferred to other institutions. The sources remain vague and inconclusive. There were disagreements among Christian authors at a time. Some viewed ancient texts as valuable cultural heritage worth preserving, while others considered them dangerous for representing pagan ideas. This duality is reflected in the lack of consistency in actions. In some regions, efforts were made to copy and translate classical works for Christian use. In others, the texts were simply destroyed.
Alexandria, as a city with strong intellectual symbolism, became an ideal stage for these religious tensions, and the Serapeum, with its Hellenistic past, was one of the primary targets of this ideological shift. The destruction of the temple and the disappearance of its library represent one of the most symbolic losses documented in ancient history. Although it was not the main library, the Serapeum was a direct link to the original system envisioned by the Ptolemies. Its end marked the interruption of one of the last remaining structures sustaining Alexandria's bibliographic tradition. By this point, the library at a museum had already lost prominence. Now, with the attack on the Serapeum, the city moved even further from its former identity as the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The 391 CE episode does not conclude the story of the Library of Alexandria, but it represents a new chapter in its decline. From that point on, the Christian expansion, the shift in cultural priorities, and the systematic erasure of ancient symbols would intensify. The destruction of the Serapeum, seen by many as a religious act, also had deep intellectual consequences, and what was once preserved in papyrus and manuscripts began to disappear, not through fire or war, but through neglect, censorship, and a shift in values. Alexandria was changing, and with it, the fate of its written legacy.
The year 391 AD marked one of the most emblematic episodes of the clash between ancient traditions and the rise of Christianity, the destruction of the Serapeum of Alexandria. Although the temple had already ceased to perform its central religious functions, its cultural importance remained. It was still seen as one of the last structures linked to the original Library of Alexandria. With Emperor Theodosius I's decrees against pagan cults, Bishop Theophilus took it upon himself to eradicate all remnants of the old religion, including the Serapeum itself, which housed symbols, artworks, and possibly ancient manuscripts. The action was carried out with the support of Christian groups and local forces. Sources such as Socrates Scholasticus report that the temple was invaded, looted, and later demolished. Statues of the god Serapis were destroyed publicly, and part of the pagan population was expelled or converted. There is no doubt that the attack was both planned and executed as a show of religious political dominance. As a building, the Serapeum was wiped off the map. However, what remains debated to this day is the fate of the collection housed inside. What happened to the texts that were once part of its secondary library? One of the few direct accounts about the contents of the Serapeum comes from Paulus Aureus, who visited Alexandria years later. According to him, he found the temple already destroyed and the boxes of books emptied. The way he describes it does not clarify whether the manuscripts had been removed before the destruction or if they were burned along with the structure. This ambiguity fuels the historical mystery. Given the hostility of the attack, it's plausible that some documents were destroyed on site, but there's also the possibility that certain texts were hidden or discreetly transferred elsewhere. There's also the argument that the Serapeum's collection was already diminished by then. Since the main library at the museum had lost prominence, it's possible that the number of manuscripts housed in the temple was small. This idea is reinforced by records suggesting many texts had been copied and disseminated in previous centuries. Still, any direct loss from the Serapeum represents a significant blow, as it was one of the last active centers of Alexandrian bibliographic tradition. Even a partial loss meant one less link to the knowledge of antiquity. The fact that books were not the main focus of contemporary reports also adds to the mystery. Most sources emphasize the religious aspect of the destruction, not the bibliographic one. This might suggest that the manuscripts were seen as secondary compared to the main goal, erasing the remnants of pagan worship. However, this lack of specific detail about the papyri also raises the possibility that their destruction was so routine it didn't even warrant mention. In this scenario, the manuscripts may have simply been burned, discarded, or repurposed without fanfare. The demolition of the Serapeum was symbolic on many levels. It represented the fall of a temple, the triumph of a new religion, and possibly the disappearance of a millennia-old manuscript repository. Politically, it was the consolidation of Christianity as the dominant force in Alexandria. Historically, it was another blow to the continuity of a project begun by the Ptolemies centuries earlier. And documentally, it became an enigma. We do not know exactly what was lost or in what quantity, but we know something was. The written legacy of antiquity suffered yet another blow. The Serapeum was not just a temple, nor merely a library. It was a symbol of the Alexandria that still resisted the empire's transformations. Its destruction did not instantly erase knowledge, but it accelerated the dismantling process already underway. The loss of manuscripts there, though hard to measure, represents a critical stage in the progressive disappearance of the ancient world's written memory. And with the Serapeum in ruins, few structures remained that still connected that era's present to the original dream of gathering all the world's knowledge in one place.
The most popular version of the end of the Library of Alexandria involves the Arab conquest to the city in 642 A.D., led by Amr ibn al-As. According to the narrative, upon taking control of Alexandria, Amr allegedly received orders from Caliph Omar to destroy all the books in the library, claiming that if they agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were dangerous. The books were said to have been used as fuel in the city's public baths, burning for months. This dramatic image became one of the most widespread accounts of the library's demise, but there's a problem. It may never have happened. The main source of this story is the Syrian Christian writer Gregory Bar Hebraeus, who lived in the 13th century, nearly 600 years after the supposed event. There is no contemporary mention of a library's destruction during the Arab conquest in Islamic or Christian records from the 7th century. Neither Amr ibn al-As nor Caliph Omar are associated with such an act in any reliable sources from that time. This raises serious doubts about the story's authenticity and suggests it may be a later fabrication. Furthermore, it's crucial to consider the state of the library at the time. Many scholars argued that the Library of Alexandria, in its original sense, connected to the Mousseon, had already ceased to exist centuries earlier. The destruction during Roman civil wars, the sack by Aurelian, the decrees of Theodosius, and the fall of the Serapeum would have thoroughly dismantled the institution. By 642, what might still have existed were smaller libraries, perhaps linked to administration or churches, but not the monumental project of the Ptolemaic era. Thus, even if books were destroyed during that period, which is also not well documented, it hardly qualifies as the burning of the Library of Alexandria, as many imagine. The symbolic weight of the story is far greater than its actual historical basis. It represents the clash of ancient knowledge and the arrival of a new empire, a new faith, and a new culture. But as a rigorous historical fact, it lacks solid evidence. Some modern historians suggest the legend arose as a way to blame the Arabs for the loss of ancient wisdom, shifting responsibility for something that had already happened centuries earlier. This kind of retrospective narrative was common in the Middle Ages, especially amid religious disputes. The fact that the source is Christian and written many centuries later reinforces the suspicion of ideological bias with more symbolic than documentary intentions. Still, the narrative persists. The image of books burning for months, fuel in the boilers of public baths, is too powerful to be forgotten. It's been reproduced in films, series, novels, and documentaries. But precisely because of its emotional impact, it must be treated with caution. In this case, history may be closer to metaphor than to factual account. The idea of an empire deliberately destroying all the world's knowledge is tempting, but probably false. Even so, this version continues to occupy the popular imagination as the final act of the Library of Alexandria. Even if it never happened, it fulfills a symbolic role. It marks the point of no return, the moment when all hope of recovering that vast collection is lost. The story of Caliph Omar has become, for many, the poetic epitaph of the library, even if it is an epitaph written more by fiction than by fact.
After so many successive tragedies and destructions, it's easy to imagine that everything related to the Library of Alexandria was wiped from history. But interestingly, that wasn't exactly the case. Some fragments of what once belonged to the library survived through time. These remnants may exist in copies preserved elsewhere in the Roman Empire, in works cited by later authors, or even in texts translated during the Islamic period. The destruction was deep, but not absolute. A clear example is the work of authors such as Galen, Euclid, Archimedes, and Hipparchus. Although we can't say with certainty that their writings were preserved directly from the scrolls of the library, it's known that many of them were part of Alexandria's collection. Because they were copied and disseminated before the destruction, part of that knowledge survived, albeit indirectly. It's as if small sparks escaped the fire and lit up other corners of the world. Furthermore, during the Middle Ages, Arab scholars played a crucial role in translating Greek texts into Arabic. Many of these works, stemming from the Alexandrian tradition, were later retranslated into Latin in medieval Europe. So even after centuries and shifts in civilization, fragments of the library's heritage found new paths to remain alive. The library's influence, therefore, didn't completely vanish with its papyrus scrolls. Another symbolic attempt to rebuild the library occurred in 2002 with the opening of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina in Egypt. This new institution, inspired by the legendary ancient library, was created to revive Alexandria's spirit as a global center in knowledge. Even though it doesn't house the original manuscripts, it represents a modern way of keeping alive the ideal of collecting, preserving, and sharing knowledge. It's also important to note that many works preserved today survived precisely because they were not in the library at the time of its destruction. Paradoxically, what survived often escaped Alexandria's reach. This shows how knowledge can have multiple anchors, and that not even a symbolic tragedy like the fall of the library was capable of extinguishing all the light of antiquity. Archaeologically, little remains of the original structure. During excavations in Egypt, some scholars believe they identified parts of the Serapeum, or spaces that could have housed scroll depositories. However, there's no definitive consensus. What endures above all is the memory, built from scattered evidence, historical accounts, and the ongoing fascination that the idea of a great lost library continues to evoke in future generations. Thus, the legacy of the Library of Alexandria isn't limited to what was destroyed, but also to what was reconstructed, reinterpreted, and kept alive in other forms. It's as if history itself found ways to preserve the essence of the library, even though its shelves and corridors have disappeared. In that sense, Alexandria lives on, not as a physical place, but as an ideal in the pursuit of knowledge.
For centuries, much has been said about fires, invasions, and violent destruction when it comes to the end of the Library of Alexandria. But there's another, quieter, and equally devastating dimension: the slow disappearance caused by time, abandonment, and natural deterioration. Books, especially ancient formats like papyrus, are extremely fragile and require constant care and controlled environments to endure. When that care fades, disappearance becomes inevitable. Imagine a papyrus scroll stored for decades in a damp place without ventilation, exposed to insects or mold. Even without a fire or direct attack, the material crumbles, corrodes, and fades away. This process was common in many centers of the ancient world, and Alexandria was no exception. The absence of preservation efforts after the library's golden age may have accelerated this silent process, erasing works before anyone noticed. Furthermore, as political and cultural shifts transformed Egypt and the Mediterranean world, the perceived value of those ancient manuscripts also declined. What was once considered priceless in one era could be seen as obsolete in another. If a new ruler saw no use in maintaining the library, the space would be neglected, funding would be cut, and care would vanish. Decay then came not with explosions, but with layers of dust. This invisible form of disappearance makes the loss even more melancholic. There is no single culprit, no central event, no date to point to as the end. Silence. A silence that grew day by day as the shelves lost their contents, as the scrolls dissolved in the hands of those few who still tried to read them, an ending without applause or screams, just forgetfulness. This kind of slow fire may have been even more effective than flames, because while fire leaves traces, smoke, ashes, memory, abandonment erases even that. And by erasing memory, it erases the symbolic value that once existed. The library wasn't just lost physically, it vanished from the minds of future generations who no longer knew what had been there. It's curious to think that perhaps there wasn't a final blaze, a last attack, or a definitive destruction. What likely happened in practice was a combination of many small disappearances over decades or centuries, until one day nothing was left, and no one noticed because the process was invisible, slow and gradual, like a candle that extinguishes itself with no wind, no interference, just because its wax ran out. This type of ending forces us to rethink how we interpret history. Not every collapse is explosive. Some are silent, long, numbed by neglect. And perhaps the saddest part of the Library of Alexandria's story is exactly that. Not witnessing its final destruction, but rather waking up one day to realize it was already gone, and the world carried on as if it were merely an irrelevant detail. As time went on and the physical traces at the Library of Alexandria faded, a new problem emerged: the near-total lack of reliable documentation about its existence and operations. While other major institutions of antiquity left inscriptions, archives, or direct descriptions of their activities, the library gradually disappeared from both the physical and written record. Many modern scholars argue that the absence of trustworthy primary sources about the library is one of the greatest tragedies in the history of knowledge. The few documents that mention the Library of Alexandria come from authors who lived centuries after its supposed foundation or destruction. This raises questions about the accuracy of these accounts, which were often based on rumors, oral traditions, or ideologically shaped versions of events. Writers like Strabo, Seneca, Plutarch, and even medieval Muslim historians provide information that contradicts each other, leaving a murky picture of what truly existed and what was idealized. From an archaeological standpoint, the challenges are even greater. The exact location of the library remains debated. The modern city of Alexandria was built over the ruins of the ancient one, making deep and systematic excavations extremely difficult. Attempts to locate traces at a library complex face structural, urban, and even political obstacles. To this day, there is no consensus on the precise site of the library's main building, which further fuels the mysteries surrounding its nature. With no surviving physical structure and scarce, contradictory sources, researchers are forced to work with hypotheses. Reconstructions of what the library might have been rely heavily on inferences based on the historical context at a time and analysis of indirect records. This opens the door to much speculation, generating romanticized, exaggerated, or even entirely fictional versions. The line between fact and fiction has become hard to define. Furthermore, a political factor influences the construction of the library's memory. Various empires, religions, and groups throughout history have shaped their own narratives about what happened to the library, each projecting their beliefs and ideologies. The library became a symbol used by different agendas, whether as a martyr of fanaticism, a symbol of the fall of knowledge, or a metaphor for the irreparable loss of ancient wisdom. The lack of concrete evidence has also made the Library of Alexandria fertile ground for conspiracy theories and mythologized narratives. Tales of secret chambers, hidden books, religious conspiracies, or deliberate sabotage still circulate today, often without any solid empirical basis. The void left by the absence of records is filled with imagination, which on one hand keeps the topic alive, but on the other seriously hinders efforts at scientific investigation. In the end, what remains of the Library of Alexandria is a combination of documentary silence, absence of ruins, and an excess of conflicting versions. This presents a huge obstacle to any serious attempt to reconstruct its history with precision. No matter how advanced modern archaeological methods may be, without consistent data, the library remains more of a shadow than a tangible institution. Its memory is suspended between what was lost and what was never known.
For a long time, the destruction of the Library of Alexandria has been romanticized and turned into a symbol of the loss of human knowledge. The image of thousands of scrolls burning in a single night, reducing centuries of wisdom to ashes, is powerful and moving. But modern scholars warn, this narrative, while impactful, does not hold up under critical analysis of the available sources. The events were not as sudden or catastrophic as they are often portrayed. Much of the confusion arises from the absence of direct contemporary documents that describe the destruction precisely. What we mostly have are accounts written centuries later, based on oral tradition, philosophical interpretations, or ideological agendas. It's like trying to reconstruct the fall of an ancient city based on poems and rumors. Modern historians, therefore, tend to distrust the most dramatic versions and prefer to investigate archaeological evidence and more plausible historical patterns. A frequently raised point is that if destruction occurred, it was neither unique nor definitive. Instead of one sudden great burning, the library likely suffered a continuous process of deterioration and loss over centuries. Looting, neglect, wars, lack of maintenance, and political changes were cumulative factors that contributed to its downfall. In this sense, the loss of knowledge was more like a slow crumbling than a single dramatic tragedy. Archaeological investigations also help dispel myths. Few physical traces have been found to confirm the existence of a grand library as described by ancient authors. This doesn't mean it never existed, but rather that it may have been more modest in physical structure than the collective imagination suggests. The grandeur of the Library of Alexandria may have been more symbolic than material, more a political ideological project than a monumental infrastructure with thousands of volumes neatly arranged on shelves. Additionally, modern scholars stress the importance of distinguishing between the main library and other associated institutions, such as the Museum. These entities are often treated as synonyms, when in fact they may have had different structures and fates. The destruction of one does not necessarily imply the destruction of the other. Recognizing these nuances is essential to understanding the real impact of what was lost and what may have never existed in the way it was told. Another critical point is the role of religion and cultural shifts. With the rise of Christianity and the persecution of practices deemed pagan, many centers of knowledge were marginalized. This didn't necessarily mean deliberate burning of collections, but rather a loss of interest in preserving them. The loss of the library may have also been a result of institutional and societal neglect for what represented an outdated worldview. Finally, many contemporary scholars argue that the destruction of the Library of Alexandria should be understood less as a single event and more as a long process with no exact date, in which neglect, conflict, and time slowly eroded one of the greatest intellectual initiatives of antiquity. This perspective does not diminish the library's symbolic value. On the contrary, it makes its story even more human and tragic, not as an explosion, but as erosion.
The ancient Library of Alexandria became such a powerful symbol of lost knowledge that even centuries after its destruction, it inspired a real attempt to bring it back. In the late 20th century, a proposal emerged to create a new institution that would honor the spirit of the original. The project was led by the Egyptian government in partnership with UNESCO, combining efforts to recover not the manuscripts themselves, but the ideal it represented, a universal center of knowledge. This initiative resulted in the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, officially inaugurated in 2002. Located on the seafront in Alexandria, its modern architecture is striking. The tilted circular building symbolizes a rising sun disk on the horizon, evoking knowledge illuminating the world. Its facade is covered in characters from ancient and modern alphabets, reinforcing its commitment to cultural and linguistic diversity. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina is not just a repository of books. It houses multiple internal libraries, museums, research centers, a planetarium, and conference halls. Its collection includes millions of books, digitized manuscripts, rare documents, and multimedia works. The goal is not to rebuild what was lost, but to create a new global technological hub of accessible knowledge, a symbolic rebirth for the 21st century. A striking feature of the new library is its investment in technology. From the beginning, it was designed to be both a digital and physical library. Digitization projects, partnerships with major institutions, and remote access to its collection are fundamental pillars. This modernity brings the Bibliotheca Alexandrina closer to contemporary demands, making it a living, connected knowledge center. The library's impact goes beyond Egypt. It has become a symbol of reconciliation between tradition and innovation, between East and West. Several countries contributed collections, equipment, and experts. International conferences, global exhibitions, and educational programs have made the institution a reference point for researchers, students, and tourists interested in the preservation and dissemination of knowledge. Still, the project is not without criticism. Some scholars argue that despite the grandeur of the structure, access to information and academic freedom are still restricted by local political issues. Others criticize the gap between its symbolic marketing and concrete results. Nevertheless, even with its flaws, the new Bibliotheca Alexandrina remains a bold gesture of humanity in the face of loss, and a hopeful step toward reconstruction. Ultimately, the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina does not try to replace the ancient one. It engages in a dialogue with the past. Its purpose is to keep alive the idea that knowledge deserves to be celebrated, preserved, and shared. In doing so, it transforms the old tragedy of loss into an opportunity for rebirth, not as a replica of what once was, but as a living bridge between ancient legacy and the future of human civilization. The Library of Alexandria represents more than just a lost building. It stands as an open wound in the history of human knowledge. Its destruction, though surrounded by layers of legend and uncertainty, left behind a palpable absence, a vacuum in the timeline of discovery. We will never know exactly what was lost among those scrolls, but we know it was precious. The very idea of gathering all the world's knowledge in one place was in itself revolutionary. Alexandria dreamed big, and that's why it's remembered, because it dared to imagine the impossible in an age when knowledge was a privilege. Its fall symbolizes the risk we face when we fail to protect intellectual heritage. It wasn't a single fire that destroyed everything, but a succession of conflicts, neglect, and political interests over centuries. This slow decay also reflects how knowledge can be eroded gradually when we stop prioritizing it. The literal fire may have happened in isolated events, but the real burning was symbolic, a gradual forgetting, a collective negligence, a silent loss. Great civilizations have collapsed, but few collapses were as quietly devastating as the fall of this library. And that raises a deep question. How much of our own era could disappear the same way? If the past was erased so easily, what stops us from doing the same with the present? The absence of records, works, and ideas stored there compromised entire fields of knowledge. The advancement of disciplines like mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy could have happened centuries earlier. We lost translations of ancient texts, theories that may never be recreated, worldviews that could have radically altered our path. The impact lies not only in what we know was destroyed, but mainly in what we'll never get to know. That is the invisible tragedy at a Library of Alexandria. It robbed humanity of a chance to be more than it is today. And what's most painful is knowing it all happened in plain sight. The world watched and didn't protect it. The memory at a Library of Alexandria has endured through time as both myth and warning. It inspired universities, research centers, museums, and even modern attempts at recreation, like the Bibliotheca Alexandrina in today's Egypt. But none of these initiatives can restore what was lost. They only pay tribute to what once was. The fascination it holds over us reveals a deep desire to centralize, preserve, and share human knowledge. The library became an eternal symbol not only of wisdom, but of its fragility, and it is precisely this fragility that demands constant vigilance. The question's no longer who destroyed the library, but rather how are we protecting the knowledge we still have. Today, we live in a world where knowledge is more accessible than ever, but also more vulnerable. Digitalization has brought huge advancements, but also new challenges: misinformation, ephemerality, manipulation of facts. In many ways, we are creating infinite libraries, and at the same time, burning parts of them every day through political decisions, censorship, or pure indifference. Alexandria reminds us that the loss of knowledge doesn't have to be dramatic or explosive. It can be silent, daily, invisible. Preserving knowledge today is more than saving data. It's about nurturing the spirit of curiosity, critical thinking, and intellectual freedom. It's ultimately about ensuring the flame of Alexandria never goes out again. Each scroll lost in that library may have been a spark of the future, an idea that could have illuminated generations, a treatise that might have cured diseases, ended wars, or inspired entire civilizations. Thinking about that isn't just about mourning the past, it's about taking responsibility for the present. We are the guardians of memory now. What we do with it defines the kind of world we'll leave behind. Alexandria may have been destroyed, but what it represented can still live on if we choose to preserve it. The destruction of a physical library is irreversible, but the destruction of its spirit can still be avoided. If we don't learn from this loss, we might be the next to be forgotten. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to receive more content like this.